Okay, so after you've divided the chapter into the various components, what I'd like to look at now is we'll just look at one particular portion which we've labeled the exposition. And I would like to argue that the exposition from this story really goes from verses 1 through 7. We'll look at the text in a few moments, but first I want to try and highlight the exposition that as we see it. First of all, the exposition focuses on the wars between the Israelites and the Philistines. You cannot understand what takes place in the essence of the story without understanding the history of the wars between the Israelites and Philistines. It's referred to at the end of the previous chapter, but also in the current chapter we have reference to that. 2, we have the state of the Israelite kingdom. In other words, we know that the Israelite kingdom is in trouble in terms of how its favor in God's eyes. We have a description of the geography, which we'll look at in a moment. We have a description of the topography, which we'll look at in a moment. And we have the factor of the dress, which is included in the exposition. Before we actually get to the action, before we actually get to the crisis, this sets the stage. So we have here 5 different components of the exposition, which let's take a look at within the verses. Okay, verses 1, 2, and 3. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and they were gathered together at Sukkot, which belonged to Judah, and pitched between Sukkot and Azekah in Ephes Damim. Here we have a description of who the Philistines are. We know the terrible wars that have gone on between the Philistines and the Israelites. We know where they are positioned. And then the second verse says, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched in the vale of Elah and set the battle in array against the Philistines. Here we see the geography. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together. That's an important phrase. In other words, they're all together. So that sets the stage in terms of the Israelites being together. And they pitched in the valley of Elah. Geography here plays a critical role in terms of the exposition. 3, in contrast to where the Israelites are, and the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. Here, the topography is laid out in very clear and explicit terms in order for us, the readers, to have a greater understanding of the drama that's unfolding in terms of the exposition. Verse 4. Once again, this is part of the exposition. And there went out a champion from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Here we are exposed to his physical attributes. We are exposed to Goliath's great human dimensions. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was clad with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a javelin of brass between his shoulder, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. We have here a very detailed description before any of the action, before the crisis surfaces, about Goliath, his physical shape, as well as his clothing and how he is clad. And you have a very elaborate description here of the weight of the armor that Goliath has and that he brings to this fight. And therefore, what we've seen here is through the exposition, in other words, this sets the stage for the crisis. This is the background material that we need in order to understand the next 4 sections of the story, as we outlined earlier, leading next to the crisis, etc. Thank you.